Welcome to Keep the Line Moving, the podcast where leadership meets life and inspiration. Here we spotlight extraordinary leaders. We're diving deep into how they inspire, motivate, and lead with strategy and empathy to achieve the extraordinary. Here we go. Episode 135 of the podcast, and I'm going to start this week's episode by asking you a question. Do you ever sit across from someone and everything they say hits home, has value, has depth, taking you down a path that you need to hear at that moment? Well, that is the experience I've had with our guest today, Todd Cherches. I've seen him in person. I've had some Zooms with him. He's a very interesting person who provides value. Hopefully, you will see throughout this conversation. Todd is an executive coach. He is also a professor. He teaches leadership, 2 classes at New York University and 1 class at Columbia. He's been doing it for many years. He's won awards as a professor. He also wrote a book. In fact, this month is the 5-year anniversary of the release of that book called VisuaLeadership. It's a very good book with a lot of great principles. We discuss the book throughout this conversation, as well as the fact that he's part of MG 100. Let me read to you what that means. Marshall Goldsmith, MG, the world's #1 executive coach and leadership thinker, launched his 100 Coaches program to personally mentor the next generation of top executive coaches in the world. Todd is one of them. You will see why in this conversation. Why did Todd get into executive coaching? He had to deal with a lot of boss holes. You know what that means, bad bosses, right? He coined that phrase, boss hole. He teaches us how to speak up, advocate for ourselves throughout this conversation. And he also tells us about working in the entertainment industry, where he had encounters with Tom Hanks, Pee Wee Herman, and the president of NBC. The conversation begins now with Todd Cherches. Okay, so let's go. Let's start here. I have obviously a giant list of things I want to talk to you about, but let's start with the MG 100 and the graciousness of Marshall Goldsmith, who, wears the khakis and the green shirt, and we see him all the time, and the great value that he brings to our industry, but to anybody who engages with his material. How did it come about that you had a relationship with Marshall Goldsmith?
Yeah, long story short, when What Got You Here Won't Get You There first came out, Marshall was doing a workshop in New York, and again, I was intimidated by him. He's a legend. In fact, the first time I had ever heard of him was in an article in the New Yorker magazine that they did a feature on him, and anyone can still find it if you just look for it online, where I had never even heard of executive coaching, and I was just fascinated by that. It wasn't even on my radar to think about it. Who knew that years later I would not only be an executive coach, but be one of his executive coaches. But when I went to one of his workshops in New York, he coined the term feed forward, right? He said, feedback is about the past. That's information, that's great, it's helpful, but you can't change the past. Let's focus on feed forward, right? What can we do in the future? So he coined that, and I went to one of his very first feed forward workshops, and it was in New York City in 2008, I believe. And I went there with 2 colleagues for the company I was working with at the time, and we went and we stayed after to talk to him. Can we talk to you for a few minutes? Well, 90 minutes later, we were like, Marshall, we have to get back to the office because we have meetings and we have stuff to do. He was just so generous. He shared his thoughts, and he said things that just always stay with me. His Buddhist philosophy of let it go, along with that hand gesture of you can't change other people, you can't change some things you just need to let go. So just take a deep breath and let it go. So Marshall has had his book, if you're watching on video, his book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, is featured on my bookshelf right behind me, because it's one of my go-tos. Even it came out in 2008, even all these years later, 17 years later, I still use his 20 habits that we need to break, because he said a lot of times we're successful not because of how we are, but in spite of how we are, and we could be even more effective and more successful if we break these 20 habits, like always needing to be the smartest person in the room, or winning too much, or trying to add too much value. So again, once you got me started, Marshall, I couldn't stop. But he's just so generous, such a nice guy, really genuine.
Todd, this is what I wanted to ask you. When I woke up this morning, this is what I wanted to talk to you about. And I started by complimenting you on the gracious nature, and like you've told me things, right? And the times that we have talked with one another, you're very sharing, right? I just like, this is amazing.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think part of it is just being authentic and who we are. Like earlier in my career, you always play a role. I'm the project manager. I'm the this. It's like that was not authentic to me. In fact, years ago, I was telling my students the other day at NYU, I took a job a number of years ago, earlier in my career. It was my first VP title, my highest salary. I had my own office, and it was a nightmare. It was the worst decision I ever made. I took the job for all the wrong reasons, but the job itself was selling, and I'm not a salesperson. I always say, even though I talk loud and fast because I'm a New Yorker, I'm an extreme introvert. I'm a three B's guy, a back of the room, behind the scenes bookworm. That's who I am in classes and workshops. So again, I love to talk. I have a lot of passion for the things I love, but that's not who I am by nature. I've had to develop that and push myself out of my comfort zone into what I call the zone of the unknown over the years. But I think part of this just we are who we are. I think that's what makes us, you as well, authentic, straightforward. You're not playing a part. It's not like, all right, now there's no off switch, right? We just are who we are 24 hours a day. And I try to be the type of professor I wish I had, and I had a few people who are like me. I try to be the kind of boss that I wish I had. I've only had a few of those. So same type of thing. Like I model after. I get that from my parents. Their authenticity, their caring about people, their empathy and compassion and humor, and I try to bring that authentically to everything that I do.
You've coined the term and almost trademarked the term boss hole. So these are bosses that you have had. We've all had. Everyone has had bosses that just don't, the values are not aligned. The alignment in the goals are not there. And you can even, there's so many layers to this. Where did you first see that the boss holiness was coming in, and how did you deal with it?
Yeah, I mean, for my very first job, I had a summer job and my boss was a jerk. So it's kind of like, you give people power, you give people authority. But here's the bottom line. Most people are thrust into managerial roles with no training and coaching. So you manage and lead the way you were managed and led, which is as a dictator, as, with being bossy, saying, all right, now it's my chance to tell people what to do. My boss at that TV network, I won't mention, when I went to her and talked to her, she said to me, I was treated like, I'll say crap, when I had your job, and now it's your turn. If you don't like it, you can leave and I can replace you tomorrow. So instead of being empathetic and compassionate, say, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to do that, she says, my turn to be the boss. It's my turn to be the jerk, the a-hole, right? So again, that's just not who I am. And I just had one. If you look in the Guinness Book of World Records for most bad bosses, I'm in there. So it's just like, whether it's luck or it's the industry I chose. It's working in Hollywood, because the values are about ego and power and control and money. It's not about nurturing. It's not about developing the next generation of leaders. And we all know you're promoted because you're good at what you do, so you get promoted into a leadership job. But managing and leading other people is not the same thing as doing that role, right? And most people have no training or coaching in how to do that well, how to build teams, how to give feedback. These are all skills that are learnable and need to be learned and developed. And they're usually not. So even with all these hundreds of books that are on my shelf, even with all these podcasts and interviews like this, we're changing the world little by little. And that's my personal mission statement, is making the world a better place, one leader at a time. And to me, everyone is a leader. That's kind of like my mantra. But not everyone shares those same values or cares enough. And it's just about getting stuff done, meeting deadlines, hitting your numbers. And very often you steamroll and trample over people in the process of trying to achieve those objectives.
I had a radio internship at a nationally syndicated, one of the very first nationally syndicated sports radio talk shows, right? And the host was a famous individual, and he sat me down. He would have one-on-ones. I think I was one of two interns. I said, do you think I have a future in this? And he says, I'm not so sure. You don't seem to have a big enough ego. You don't seem to have enough edge in your personality, and you really need to be more of an a-hole, right? I'm not going to say, but more of a, and I looked at him and I said, and this is my 20-year-old, 21-year-old version of life. And I looked at him and I thought to myself, he's successful. He lays out in his pool all day and then comes in and does the radio. That's a pretty cool life. He looks like he's relaxed and enjoying himself. And I said to myself in that moment, Todd, I said, I am never going to be like this guy, ever. I don't care. I'm going to try to make it in a virtuous way. Right now, if I made mistakes and if I'm a human being, I have failed, I have succeeded, and I have been in between. But one thing I tried to pride myself on is not be that. Yeah. So back to you, to training, Todd, and educating people and getting them to understand at least how they're coming across is vitally important. Wouldn't you think?
Yeah, I mean, you were true to your values as I was. That was what my dream. I mentioned this in my TED Talk. My very first the opening of my TED Talk is as a kid. When people say, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" I would say, "I want to be Superman." And then I said, "Well, if that job's taken, what's your backup?" I said, "Batman." Those were my only two. But then we grew up in the TV generation, flipping channels and watching superheroes and stuff. But then my dream was to work in television in some capacity. I didn't even know what the jobs were, but I love television that much. I mean. My parents would go to sleep at like 11. I'd get out of bed and watch Johnny Carson, right? So
Yes,
and this
yes.
was at age 10 or 11. So I love television. So I started working for Michael Nesmith of the Monkees. My students have no idea who the Monkees are, or who Michael Nesmith was, but that was my first job in LA. Then I worked for Aaron Spelling on Dynasty, just putting scripts together. Then I was in casting at Columbia Pictures, comedy at Disney, and then drama at CBS. And I love being on the studio a lot. I love being able to sit in on a taping. I got to sit on Seinfeld's couch. I got to sit on Norm's bar stool on the Cheers set. So just like the magic of going behind the scenes was just amazing. Unfortunately, the reality was, like what that person said to you, I wasn't cut out for the business. I didn't have the confidence. I didn't have the cutthroat nature. And I think if I was more like I am now back then, I might have figured out a way to make it work. But at the time, I just didn't. And I eventually left television, got into the theme park business as a project manager, and never looked back. But my TV years were just magical. Working in Hollywood, and it was just, I loved it. I loved all the excitement and the celebrities I met. I had lunch with Tom Hanks because we were just walking to the commissary together, and Pee Wee Herman interviewed me to be his personal assistant. I was talking about my half hour alone with Pee Wee Herman. So like those are magical experiences that you don't have if you're not in that business or in that town. But then the reality set in of like the horrible bosses and the toxic cultures and the dysfunctional everything. And I just kind of got into the theme park business as a project manager, and that changed the course of my career because I ended up going to China to oversee the installation of a theme park attraction. And that kind of was my origin story for my visual thinking methodology that I write about and talk about in my TED Talk. So again, it's like Robert Frost's poem, The Road Not Taken, right? You hit a fork, you take a path, you think you're going to come back someday. You don't know what would have happened if you took the other path, but the path we choose leads us down the road, and there's no turning back. And that led to what I'm doing today. But all the horrible bosses I had is what drove me into reading all these business books, taking management leadership courses, and becoming an executive coach and a professor. So if it wasn't for all these horrible bosses, I would not be doing what I'm doing today, and I would not be who I am today. So again, turning the lemons into lemonade and trying to make something good out of it. So.
But you still learned, developed, and there it launched you. It was part of your foundation. And what I told myself also in those days, in those early years, Todd, is I'm just going to outwork everybody. I'm going to do it the way I want to do it with my values, and I will outwork you.
Yeah.
And that's something that you can control, right? You can control.
Well, another thing I always say to my students, because
please.
this is something I learned the hard way, we always think that our work is going to speak for ourselves, but we need to speak for our work. I was part of a 6-person consulting team, London-based company. I was one of the New York consultants, and every project they would pick one of us to be the lead on that project, and I never got picked. A year went by, I never once got picked, even though I knew I was better than the others. I got really frustrated. I kept waiting to be chosen, and I wasn't. I finally got up the courage and confidence to ask the head of the company to say, why have I never been picked? She says, why? Because you never asked, right? So I said, all I had to do was ask. She said, yeah, if you told me you were ready, if you said you wanted to. So she said, now that I know, you're in charge, you'll run the next one. So it's like I wasted like 6 months, actually more than that, almost a year, sitting and waiting to be called, when if I had raised my hand and said I'd like to do this, I would have been called a year earlier. So again, I always remind my students of that while it's nice when we're chosen, I always say this too, that's another one of my mantras, people are not mind readers. When you say, why don't they just this, or they should do this, or why wasn't I picked? It's like, they're focused on themselves. They're not focused on you. So if you want something, if you need something, you need to raise your hand.
That's a great point. And I wrote down advocacy, and that's something that's a major part of my programs as well. You had a wonderful moment back in May of 2020. We were all going through COVID, but you were releasing a book. Tell us about visual leadership. I'm going to put you on the spot. Give me the core of it in 30 seconds, and then we can branch out. How about that?
Sure. Visual leadership is the application of visual thinking to the practice of leadership. That's as brief as I could get. What is visual thinking? It's thinking in pictures and imagery as opposed to words and numbers, right? I always talk about 3 Fs: facts, figures, and feelings. People are not motivated and inspired by facts and figures. They're motivated by feelings. So I always say, when I work with some of my clients, they try to blow people away with the numbers. We're going to increase shareholder value by 2.3% this quarter. That is not a reason to get out of bed, right? What's the vision? What's the story? What is the what's the so what, so that about the numbers? We're both storytellers, right? Tell me a story about what the future is going to look like. Tell me a story about a time you failed. Tell me a story about the worst or best boss you've ever had, or the best or worst team you've ever been on. That's how people learn. But stories have villains, victims, and heroes. There are beginnings, middles, and ends. There's a quest. There's obstacles and challenges. There's lessons learned. So we're both in the storytelling business, only we now apply it to the practice of leadership and to teaching. But that's a big part of what my methodology is about, and my book is about, my work is all about. It's about, if I had to sum it up in one catchphrase, it's how do you get people to see what you're saying? I'll leave it at that.
That's awesome. You did a heck of a job on that. All right, let's go to the CEO, because I've heard you tell these stories and read it, but let's go to the CEO who thinks, okay, I'm going to go up there and I'm going to deliver a PowerPoint. It's going to have metrics and numbers, and I'm going to be even keel. The goal is the information, not the story. They need to have the information. What is that CEO missing?
Yeah, you need to package that information into a story, because what's the so what of that numbers, right? I always say like, for example, I always use this example as if I say I have a 250 average, is that good or bad? Well, in baseball, it's mediocre. In bowling, it's amazing, right? The context is different. The number 250 has no inherent meaning outside of the context of the number and the story you're trying to tell. And the chapter of my book where I really go into this is called how my cardiologist almost gave me a heart attack. So I went those of us over 50 need to have all these tests and make sure our hearts are ticking okay. So my cardiologist came back. He said, based on your numbers, you have a 5% chance of having a heart attack within the next 10 years. And I almost passed out, hit my head on the table, and had a heart attack right then and there. But then I said, wait a minute, does that mean that there's a 95% chance that I won't have a heart attack in the next 10 years? He's like, yeah, that's another way of looking about it. It's like, your tests are perfect, everything looks great. It's like, why did you frame it in that way? So what he said was not wrong, but was that the message he wanted to tell? Was that the story he wanted me to take away? Not at all. So again, the numbers were accurate, and yet I got the exact opposite meaning from it. So often people give people numbers and data and statistics, but they don't package it. They don't present it in a story or in a way that I always say, what do you want people to think, feel, know, and most importantly, do with whatever information you're presenting them with, right? So again, your numbers may be right, but if you're not using them correctly, then people are not going to get the message that you're intending to deliver. So that's just one of many examples and stories of why people either bore people to death with statistics, or their numbers get misconstrued and you get lost in the details and you don't get the main message, which was the whole intent of that story or that report or that PowerPoint presentation.
How often do you have coaching clients and/or workshops where you observe and you're looking at this new group of CEOs? You've not met them, or high-level C-suite folks. You have not met them, but you can see that. I always say this: the audience, whether it's a TED Talk, whether it's a presentation, a keynote, or even a smaller workshop with 25 people, there's people that are all in on what you're saying, and they're smiling, they're nodding, they're all in. There's folks that are in the middle, and they can come in and be part of the party, right, and participate, and maybe they'll convert to the other left side here on this little ledger that I'm putting together. And then there are those that just think you are full of it, right? And that's life, right? That's life. There's those categories, and there's probably other categories. How do you get the folks that just think that what you're saying doesn't make sense? It's not, to your earlier point about how they were raised as leaders. They were, in a command and control environment. Now they're fostering one. Whatever the reasons are, how do you move these folks to say, hey, it's not necessarily about you. You got to see kind of how 2025 is, and AI, and the complexities of information and sharing and servant leadership. How do you do it, Todd?
Yeah, I mean, the most important thing is that, leaders need to realize that leadership is not about them. It's about the people they're leading, right? It's kind of like, there's that saying, a leader without followers is just someone who's out for a walk. If you're like, I'm a leader, follow me, and you look behind you and there's no one there, it's like, are you really leading, right? So Peter Drucker said leadership is about influence. It's about having a vision. It's about getting people to buy into your vision. It's not only about formulating that vision, but are you communicating that vision in a clear and compelling way, right? Looking at the baseball season, what's the vision? Is to hold that championship trophy up and be spraying that champagne all over each other in the locker room, right? So every game of the season, even before starting in spring training, that's the vision, right? Is to capture that championship. Whether you're a San Francisco Giant fan or a Yankee fan or a Met fan like I am, your vision is winning that championship, right? If you lose sight, you got to keep your eyes on the prize, as the saying goes, right? If you lose sight of that vision and you make it all about your personal statistics, and if your sacrifice bunt will win the game and you're swinging for a home run because you're trying to be the home run champion, your personal objectives are in opposition to your team's objectives, right? There are certain players who play to win, like Derek Jeter, who I was using as an example. Like, you measure him by, was he the greatest shortstop in history? No, but he was a winner, right? He won championships, and he said, your team was, he didn't say the season was a failure if you didn't win the World Series, but that's what it was all about, right? It was about playing to win. It was about a team player. It's not just about putting up amazing numbers and coming in last place, right? So some leaders are more about them. They want to put up the amazing numbers. It's not about you. It's about the vision, the mission. It's about helping develop the next generation of leaders. So servant leadership is about that. The first time I'd ever heard that term was, I tell this story in my book, my Graham Tinker story. When I moved out to LA, I got on the plane, and in first class, Graham Tinker, the president of NBC, formerly the husband of Mary Tyler Moore, he was on the same plane as me. And here I am flying out to LA, a 24-year-old kid trying to seek fame and fortune in Hollywood. I somehow got the courage to go up and talk to him about an hour before we were about to land. And the story I tell in the book, he was sitting in the aisle seat in first class. I said, "Excuse me, Mr. Tinker, can I talk to you for a second?" I don't remember what I rambled. He actually got up from his seat, moved over to the window seat, and said, "Hey, I'll sit down for 5 minutes." And he got me a Diet Coke this was like the best Diet Coke I've ever had in my life. But he just sat there and talked to me for 15 minutes. And he said, when we get to LA, here's my card. He's like, "I probably won't be able to talk to you, but call my secretary, tell her we spoke, and she'll set up some meetings for you." Now, I didn't end up with a job at NBC, but those meetings gave me the courage and confidence, and I learned so much. But what he said to me was, my job, my people don't report to me, I report to them.
I love that story. I could listen to that all the time. I could even taste that Diet Coke. It's just special.
Yeah.
All right, one more question, and then we're getting to all-star moments where it's rapid fire.
Okay.
Behind you are several copies of Visual Leadership, but not every book on those shelves behind you is Visual Leadership. So I will ask you this. I know you're a voracious reader. Why is reading especially important for a boss hole, right? Somebody who just isn't getting it. How can we help them? Why does reading help leadership? Why does reading help you understand yourself? I want you to explain your thoughts on that, please.
Yeah, I was, most people think I must have been a business major because of what I do, but I was an English literature major, so with a concentration in Shakespeare and poetry. So I grew up reading Hardy Boy novels, and I loved comic books. And so I'm just a reader. But even if you're a listener, you can still listen to audiobooks. You can watch TED Talks. You can listen to podcasts like this one. It almost doesn't even matter, but you need to be a continuous learner, right? JFK says, this is the very first quote I opened up my NYU course with. JFK said that leadership and learning are indispensable to each other, right? Harry Truman said, not all readers are leaders, but all leaders are readers, right? Reading is just about taking in information. Eleanor Roosevelt said, learn from the mistakes of others. Life's too short to make them all ourselves, right? So it doesn't matter who said what. So I'm filled with all these quotes. There's no end to them, so I'll stop there. But reading is, to me, when you read a book, it's like having a conversation in your head with the author. So when I read a book, all my book, this is my book, by the way, they're all filled with Post-its and underlines and highlights. I keep my colored markers with me when I'm reading. That's how I engage with the content, right? I doodle in the side and in the margins. I circle things. I create my own table of contents at the beginning of a book. If someone says, oh, how do you remember which book and which page something's on? It's because I really engage with each book. So that to me is when you're reading a book by Dan Pink or Seth Godin or Marshall Goldsmith, you're engaging with their brain, right? Or if you're reading Plato or if you're reading Shakespeare, right? Doesn't matter what it is. You're taking in information and it'll help you learn, help you grow. It improves your speaking skills, it improves your grammar, improves your spelling, your writing skills. So to me, again, I'm a big reader, but it doesn't matter whether you're watching, listening, reading. The medium almost doesn't matter. It's like we need to be constantly learning. And I always talk about in terms of insights, actions, and outcomes. So I'm going to say it again, insights, actions, and outcomes. At the end of every coaching session, at the end of every class, at the end of every workshop, insight, what did you take away? Action, what are you going to do with it? Outcome, what's going to change or be better as a result of it, right? So I always think in that terms. I always frame it in that terms. And I always ask my students or my coaching clients, because I always say that the true value of knowledge is not in its accumulation, but in its application, right? How are you going to use, take one thing away from this conversation that we had today? What's one thing, hopefully it's 5 or 10 things, but for listeners, what's one thing you could take and literally do something different with as a result of what you heard today? And what's the outcome, the result going to be, the improvement going to be, and the change, what's the change going to be? So I'm always thinking, and that's how we learn and that's how we grow, right? By taking new ideas, trying them out. They're not all going to work perfectly the first time or at all, but we're trying new ways and new approaches, and that's how we develop ourselves and develop others.
For those that think in a competitive way, my world coming from professional sports, right? Everybody wants the competitive edge. Coaches watch film. Executives want a high revenue generation. How do we get more social followers? Well, when you read and what you beautifully just said, it gives you a different perspective. You're having a conversation with the author. That gives you a competitive edge. It's right there. A podcast. How do I think differently? How do I, touch the heart of that person so they'll do better work? There's a method to the madness. Why continuous learning is so important. All right, here we go. First thought, best thought. These are short, rapid fire answers. You just have to think and go. Are you ready?
I am ready.
We will get to all-star moments in just a second. To grow as a leader, you must make intentional choices about how you want to show up for yourself and your team. Are you ready to grow your leadership? The Gargano Leadership Group offers expert coaching, consulting, and workshops rooted in our 4 leadership pillars: curiosity, alignment, optimism, and self-awareness. Leadership starts with forging authentic connections, communicating your values, leading with energy and enthusiasm, and truly understanding yourself. Visit garganoleadership.com to get started with us today. Back to the show. Pick your shortstop and be honest. Don't just defer to the hometown person. Here, you probably will anyway.
I cannot.
Ozzie Smith, Derek Jeter, or Cal Ripken?
I have to pick Jeter.
I knew it. That was a layup. Wrong sport. Okay. The best New York Met of all time.
Tom Seaver.
Oh, I love that. Best Yankee of all time.
That's a tough one. There's so many great ones. I'm going to go with Jeter.
And your favorite TV show of all time?
Seinfeld. That's not even didn't even have to think twice about that.
What is a little more serious here? What is our number one leadership challenge in today's work world?
I always use the term VUCA, right? I didn't make it up, but VUCA is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. It's more VUCA than ever, right? So how do we navigate and make decisions when the future is so uncertain? I think that's one of the biggest challenges among many.
Describe yourself as a leader in one sentence.
Try to be the type of leader that you wish you had.
This has been tremendous. Thank you. Todd, have a great day.
Thank you, Chris.
And we thank Todd very much for coming on the show. I have several takeaways from this conversation. Let's get to them. Number one, the advantages of continuous learning. Does this come up on the podcast all the time? Answer, yes. Everyone talks about it. If you're going to lead people, teach people, mentor people, you have to do the work yourself so you could frame the way you think more clearly. Hence, reading books. Todd said it's like having a conversation with the author. I love that. And he goes into detail with his colored markers and his sticky notes throughout his books. He showed that to us if you're watching on our YouTube channel. Podcasts, whatever the case may be. Then, number two takeaway, servant leadership. that conversation he had on that cross-country flight with the then NBC president, Grant Tinker, who said, "My people don't report to me, I report to my people." Thinking that way, that's why he was so successful, meaning Grant Tinker, but also why Todd is able to teach effectively at NYU and Columbia, and his workshops and coaching, executive coaching that he does. And then lastly, the third takeaway, Todd's motto of insights, actions, and outcomes. Learning, putting them into effect, and then what change are you providing by all of that? Great advice for his students, again, his executive clients, workshops, etc. And we thank, before we go, Damon Lemby, our mutual friend, Learn It, the CEO, for introducing Todd and me. I am so thankful. Have a great week, everybody. Hope you enjoyed this conversation. Take care. Share the podcast. Give us a thumbs up. Write a review. You know we appreciate it. Have a great week. Thanks for tuning in to Keep the Line Moving. If you enjoyed this episode, give us a thumbs up, subscribe, and leave a review. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Most importantly, share this podcast with your friends, family, and coworkers. It means the world to us. If you have a guest recommendation, visit our website at garganoleadership.com, where you'll also find all our archived episodes. For our marketing coordinator and the producer of this podcast, Savin Narwal, I'm Chris Gargano. Have a fantastic week, everybody.